Let's look at the solutions for the 2019 exam paper, question 4. In this question, you needed to select from a combo box either maze 1, maze 2, maze 3. You are also given 3 text files corresponding to each maze. And depending on the maze that you choose, you need to read that particular text file. And the contents of that text file should also be stored in an array that is provided. In order to code that, you had to first get the value from the combo box. So this is your maze. That's the name of the maze that you are getting from the combo box. Now this name, for example, it could be maze 1. That corresponds to a text file, maze1.txt. So this file name, this needs to be the value that you read, and we need to add a .txt to it. So here, the check is if the file exists, and here is the name of the file and the plus txt. Maybe you could have added a step, like you could have had a variable called file name and assigned maze name plus .txt to file name, and when you are checking, then you just use file name in place. That could possibly have been easier to understand. But effectively, you're taking the file name and adding a .txt to it to see if it exists, and if it doesn't, display a message and come out of the procedure. If it does exist, then create a link between the internal and the external, maze name.txt. Don't forget to add the .txt, and then open the file for reading. The file is now open, so you can read from the file. So here, you got a variable called count. Count is set to 0, and count is reading the number of lines that are being read from the text file. So while it is not the end of the file, we increment count. That means it's the first line that has been read, and that variable is now read from the file into a variable called line. That is then taken and stored into the array at that position count in array maze, and it is then printed. This is now the line number, because the question wants you to print the line number. Count is serving that purpose. Here's your tab space, and this is the value that was read from the text file. So as that loop continues, count increments, you read the second line, it's stored in the array and it's displayed, and that loop just continues until there's no more information in the text file. After it finishes, the text file is then closed. So that was 4.1, which was relatively straightforward. In question 4.2, here you had to now determine the maximum number of consecutive horizontal open spaces. Those are the dashes every time you find a dash. But you need to find the consecutive number of dashes in a row, and you need to know what's the maximum number of all of these rows. Which one has the maximum number of consecutive spaces? So just to brainstorm a way of solving the problem, you need to first read one line at a time from the array. So you're going to need one loop just to allow you to get each line from the array. So that's one loop required there. And here's a diagram where we have an array. The array contains each line, each of these lines. That's what the array contains. So we're going to need one loop to be able to read all the lines in the text file. One loop is going to be required. Having read the line, I now when I say read the line, I mean I get the line from the array, not to be confused with a text file where we're doing reading. We are not reading from a text file, we're getting the value from the array. So having obtained the value from the array, I now need to look at each character in the string that we've just read. I now need to look at each character. And another second loop is then going to be required to allow me to look at each character. And as I'm searching, I need something to count the consecutive spaces. I need something to count the consecutive spaces. And as I count the consecutive spaces, I need another variable that will track what the highest is. Because in one line, I've got, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've got 7 consecutive, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So in the one line, I need to track what's the highest number of spaces I have. And then I need another high that's going to check which is the highest amongst all of the lines. So there's a lot of things that are going on here. There's 2 loops, one to go through the entire array, another loop to check each character, one high to track the highest in the line, and then another high variable to track the highest amongst all of the lines that are being read. Let's look at how we go about solving that. So here's the first loop for I from 1 to I row count. So this is my I row count, that's a constant, and that value is set to 16 because we've got 16 cells in our array. We've got 16 cells in the array. So we read the first value from the array. We read the first value from the array, and I'm storing it in a string variable called str. So this is read, and there's the entire line, and I'm storing it in a variable called str. And then here I've got a counter, and I've got a high row. So remember, we need to find the highest value in that row. So that's what high row is doing. It's finding the highest value in that row. There's another high value, but this high value is finding the highest value amongst all of the rows. So let's look at how we go about doing this. Having read the value from the string, I'm now going to check each character. So this loop here is now, I'm going to check each character, and I'm going to look for consecutive. So consecutive characters means if I'm checking position J and I'm checking if that is a dash, then next to that consecutive will be J plus 1. And if that is a dash. So if strj is a dash and J plus 1 is a dash, that means you've got them consecutive. So I've got 2 dashes that I found. So I start count at 1, and when I increment it, it means that's my second value. So each time it finds something consecutive, count will just increment. But when J is a dash and J plus 1 is not a dash, it means that I found a character that's no longer consecutive. And if it's no longer consecutive, I want to check the count that I picked up with all my consecutive values and check if that is greater than my high row. Recall that high row is finding the highest number of consecutive dashes in one particular row. And if it's greater, then I take count and I store it in this variable called high row. And if I found a character that's no longer consecutive, I reset my count to 1. So that when I go back to the top and I'm working, when I go back up here and I find another set of consecutive values, I start that counter from 1 again. Thereafter, I check if that high row in that particular row is greater than high. High is tracking the highest within all of the rows that I've read. And if high row is greater than high, then I store that in high row, and I've got another variable called highest rows that I initialize to null. So the minute you find a new high value, high row comes into effect. It is set to a null. And if high row equals high, and remember the first time round, high is being assigned to high row, therefore high row must equal to high, then I accumulate the positions where I found those rows. This is I, the rows where I got the highest. So what this is effectively doing, it's helping me to determine if I've got multiple rows that have the highest number of consecutive dashes. It is possible that some rows, more than one, the highest could be 7 dashes, and there could be more than one row that actually has 7 dashes. So that's where, that is why I'm checking if high row equals to the highest, then track and accumulate all of those rows that do have the highest. And I then display the longest corridor that was found and with the number of spaces. So this is now displaying the highest. So there's a lot that's happening in the solution. It's important for you to go through it in detail and to analyze it. This is the end, which means it takes me back to the I loop where the second row is read, and then processing takes place in the second row, quite a bit of processing, looking for consecutive. When the consecutive ends, then looking for the highest, and then also displaying if it was the highest. In my opinion, this was quite a tough solution within an exam situation and consideration. Many students would not necessarily have been able to solve this completely, but at least if you had the basics in place where you're checking for consecutive values, then when it's non-consecutive, you have the concept of finding highest. All of this would have got you marks. So you want to try to see how you can get as many marks as possible. Study the solution to the best of your ability and try to see if you can then write something to solve a problem of this nature. I hope this helps you.